Okay, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to Add the Migrate module to your Toolbox session. Let's start with a small overview of what I will cover in this session. First, a small introduction. Next, 1 minute slide about the ETL process. Next is an overview of the Migrate module. And following that is the longest part. I will cover some topics I encountered during a project, and to close the session, an overview what has been covered. So let's get started. One way or another, everyone has to deal with migration when you're building a new site, and especially with Drupal 8, because migration is the only way to upgrade your website. So the main use case for this session is a frequently asked question site of the tutorial services of the engineering faculty of the KU Leuven. It was built mid the 90s and was a custom application on a LAMP stack. And a few years ago, it was obvious that it was no longer maintainable, and that's when we decided to rebuild it in Drupal. But there were a lot of questions on this site that were still a good resource for a student, so it was a prerequisite to migrate all the existing content. One side note, what about feeds? Most of you also know feeds. It's a great model to migrate content, and it's a great alternative, but mainly for what I call easier migration. And by easier I mean content that doesn't need some kind of massage to get it into a Drupal site. So as I thought, I used Migrate during a project while I was working at the engineering faculty. I was an IT expert and a tutor at the faculty, but since last week I found a new job, and now I'm a data scientist at a supply chain optimization firm, where I still have to deal with data and migrations. So let's start with the ETL process, just in 1 minute, one slide. It's a shorthand for extract, transform, and load, and that's basically what you do with all your data when you migrate it. Extract is the first step. You get your data from your source, and you determine what data you need in your new website. Once you know that, you need to transform it, because often the source data is not in the right form for your destination. So you need, what I call it, to massage it. You need to convert things, remove data, do calculations, whatever you need to get it in the right shape. And once it is in the right shape, you need to load it into your destination. And that's, in a nutshell, what the Migrate module does for you. So I will walk through the different parts of the Migrate module using the example use case. So I mentioned already, students ask questions online. Members of the didactical team answer these questions. Students can search questions that have been answered, and there's also some kind of table of content. Just to give you an idea what this site looked like. Very basic, so a list of all the courses available, for instance, physics. In this course you have different chapters, for instance, fluids and waves and sound and so on. And you can drill down, for instance, fluids. You get an overview of the asked questions with an answer, and that's what I had to deal with. So the first part, the extract phase of the ETL process, is already a great example of object-oriented programming and inheritance. So you have, in the Migrate module, you have the abstract class Migrate source. It contains all functionality to get information from your source database. However, there are some operations that are specific to your data source. For instance, some operations are different when you use an SQL database or JSON or something like that. And these functions are implemented in those subclasses. You have different sources you can read data from. You have XML, Oracle, Microsoft SQL, MariaDB, comma-separated value files. And if that doesn't suit you, you can even write your own migrate source class. The only thing you need to do is subclass migrate source and implement all abstract functions. And in this particular case, all data was stored in a MySQL database. So normally I would use the migrate source SQL subclass, but for some reason I could not connect to the database. Or whatever I tried, I could not connect. I suspect that the database is way too old. So I used the workaround. I dumped all the data in a comma-separated value file, and I used the migrate source CSV. So to give you an idea what the data look from, it's not that nice, but well, I have to work with it. So we have a column with the ID of the question, the title of the question, the user ID of the student who asked the question and his email, and the date when the question was asked. And more relevant columns were the year it was asked, the number of the question, the user ID of the responder, the course the question belongs to, the chapter the question belongs to. There was, in the early days, there was also some kind of 5-star feature where students could rate the questions, but I skipped that one. And then you have the text of the question, the text of the answer, and the time the question was asked. So how do you get started? Very easy. You create a new subclass of the class migration. So migration already contains a lot of functionality. The only things you have to define in your subclass is things specific to your use case. So all the information is defined in the constructor. So the first thing you have to do is initialize the migration by calling the constructor of the superclass. You can add some description if you like. And next you define your source. In this case, I defined the relevant columns of my CSV file. Very easy. I construct the path to my file, and then you can set your source, so the source attribute. And what I do is I create a new migrate source CSV object with the file path, the columns I defined, and some options. So in this case, I set 2 options. So I set the header rows option to 1. This means that the first row of my data file is the header of each row. And second option, I set the delimiter to semicolon. Again, great example of object-oriented programming. All the main functionality is in the superclass migration. And for specific to migration, you just define it in the subclass. Now, this is an overview of the target content types. So of the load part, it's a basic content type. So with a title, a body, and some taxonomy references. Also answer, images, and attachments. Nothing particularly, but this is really important if you look at the next step, the mapping. So when you transform your data, you have to tell the Migrate module what information from your input maps to information from your target. So for instance, and you also have to keep track which row from your source belongs to some output in your Drupal site. So they keep track of the IDs from your source and your destination, and this is gathered in what they call a map. So in this case, it's a map stored in SQL where you define the ID from the source and the ID from your target, in this case, a node. And once you have this, you can set your destination. In this particular case, it's just a node. So I create a new object of the migrate destination node, and as a parameter, I give the machine name of the content type. Thus, in this case, the machine name is question. And that's the first part of setting up your source, your destination, and how to keep track on how to know what is your source and to which target does it belong to. Second part is the mapping of the data. For instance, you do some field mappings The format is, the first parameter is the destination property, and the second parameter is the source property. For instance, the second field mapping, I tell that the question column from my CSV file should be mapped to the body of the question content type. Same thing for the first one. The title column of my file should be mapped to the title property of the question content type. You can also set some additional options. For instance, for the body, I want the format to be full HTML. And some other mappings as an example. For instance, the created property of the question content type gets the information from the date column, and so on and so on. You don't always need to map everything. For instance, there were some columns in my input file that were redundant for the question content types, so you can just add them to the add unmigrated sources. That just means, well, these columns, I know they are available, but I will not use them. The same thing goes for the destination fields. There were a lot of fields over there, for instance, the language, the comment, log, revision, user ID. I will not use them. Why do I mention this? Because if you have a look at the overview, you get it when you go in the website to administration, content, migrate, and you click one of the available migrations. You get an overview, and there you will see a lot of information about the current migrations. For instance, you find information on your source data, on your destination data, and also your mapping summaries. And this is a great way to see which field has already been mapped to destination fields. So once the mapping is okay, you're ready to migrate. In the same user interface, you see which migrations are available. In this particular case, there were 4 migrations. You just select one or more, and then you can do some operations on them. For instance, import. It's very obvious what it is. It starts the migration and imports data. You have also rollback to undo all performed imports. You can do a rollback and re-import, stop, reset. So a lot of operations available. For some of these, you also have some options. Very interesting is the limit to. If you want to try something before you do an import of 10,000 rows, you can do a limit to items, X items, for instance, limit the import to 5 items, or 10 or 100, whichever is suitable. So that's the general part about the Migrate module. In the section various topics, I will show you different kind of things I encountered while I was working on this project, some snippets. Some of them took me a long time to figure some things out, so that's why I want to show you to you to save you some time. So first thing that was really useful is dependencies. You can have multiple migrations, and it's very common to have migration that depends on another migration. In this particular case, before I can import all the questions, I need to import first the structure of the chapters in the courses. So that's why I have dependency on all chapter in one migration. And it also recurs if, for instance, suppose that all chapters in one migration depends on another migration, it takes all these constraints into account. How do you add the dependency? Really easy, again in the constructor. And you add an array of all the migrations your migration depends on, and the attribute dependency. That's all you have to do. So really easy. Also a great feature is the DRUSH integration. It's better and faster than the user interface. You can do all operations, start, import. You can also get the current state of the migration. For instance, there are 10,000 rows available in the input. I already processed 500 and I still have 9,500 rows to go. And I have 20 error messages. So that's really handy. It's way faster than the user interface. And I also added a link to why you should use DRUSH and when you're doing migrations. DRUSH is really easy. Most common commands you will use is DRUSH MI for migration. Next is the name of the of your migration, and you can also add options, for instance, limit the import operation to 100 items, rollback, or get a migrate status as the last comment of the question migration, and there you get an overview of where DRUSH is in the migration. Now, I was talking about massaging the data. You do this by implementing the PREPAREROW function. So it takes one parameter, a row, and what is this row? It is an object with all the information from one particular row from your input source. And this is the last chance you get to change your data before it's mapped to a Drupal entity. And the great thing is, it returns a boolean, and if this boolean is true, this means this row will be imported, and if it's false, this particular row will not be imported. In this particular case, in my input row, I had a column with the date, for instance, October 2nd, and I had another different column with the time, for instance, 4 p.m. in the afternoon. I defined a helper method that takes these two pieces of information and just make one date of one timestamp of it. So what I do is I call this method, and the result I get from this method, I put it in the date attribute of the row. So I have massaged the date into what I want before it's mapped to a Drupal content type. Once the loading is done, you can do the same thing. So you have a prepare function with two parameters. One is in this particular case, or in general, the entity that has been created after importing the row. And the second parameter is the row, so the original data from your input. And this function is called right after the Drupal entity is created. So I use entity here as a general term. It could be content, a user, file, comment, whatever. And this is the last chance to change this entity before it is saved. So in this particular case, well, what do I do? Well, I set the format of the body field and the field answer field to filtered HTML. You can do whatever you want, whatever you need. Another topic that I spent quite some time to figure it out. In this particular case, a question belongs to some chapter of some course of a specific year. So the chapter it belongs to the unique chapter it belongs to is a combination of these three parts. So in this particular case, the mapping of the question is of the start of the chapter was composed of combination of three keys from your source. So it looks very familiar to the hook schema format. So you have to define each column with the type and description, and if it's null or not. So these combination of these three columns is the key from my source, and the key from the destination is just basically the key schema of a term, as the chapter is in this particular case, the taxonomy. This is an example of how to import a user. I could say it's the same old. Three basic steps. So you define your input, your mapping, and your destination. So in this particular case, the destination is a user, so you use the key schema of the user. So that's the first part. Next, I define the columns from my source input, which I will be used to create users in Drupal. Again, I use a CSV file with the same options, so nothing new here. The only new thing is the destination is now a migrate destination user object instead of migrate destination node object. And here again, another example of mapping. For instance, the target name property will get its information from the UNR and it will skip a lot of columns to migrate. While mapping users, I also had to do some massaging of the data before it was saved, because the way roles were stored in the source database was basically unclear. Also, what I do here is I check if the role didactical team is exists already. If not, I create it again, and I do the saving by myself. So here the difficult part was, how do you map a role of a user? And apparently it was a strict format. It's basically a map with as a key value the role ID and value the role name. It was very particular. It was not something I expected, and I spent quite some time to figure this out. This is an example of how to migrate gates. This is a use case of an organizational website. So they had some events with a start and end date. And apparently you had to do some weird things because the date span had to be JSON encoded. So I didn't see that one come. But after looking for a long time, I figured this out. And another example of massaging the data, what I do is from the body text, which contains all the information of the event, I replace all new lines with the break tag. Something also that took quite a long time for me to figure out is how to deal with references. So this is from a Drupal 6 site to a Drupal 7 site, and the event content type has a reference to a location content type. So what I had to do here is basically create a query to find the right location content, and once I found it, you had to use something really weird. You had to use the target ID key. So it took me a long time to figure it out. I thought that I just had to add the location to the array, field location, and 0, just add it. No, you had an additional key, target ID. And you store the node ID of your location content in that particular place. So it took me quite some time using DSM and DPM to find this out. Also, something different is when you're migrating users from Drupal 6 to Drupal 7, because most users will have a password stored in your source database, and it is encrypted. So you would suspect this option would be true by default, but you have to specify explicitly that the password stored in your source database is already encrypted with MD5. It also took me quite a long time to figure that out. It didn't make any sense to me, but well, there are a lot of things that don't make sense to me. So I also had to migrate a lot of files and images. This is again something from the frequently asked questions website project. In the answers of the assistant or professor, there could be links to additional files that were stored somewhere on the server. So I had no record in the database where these files are. So the difficulty here was how to get the URI. So I had to use some regular expressions. So how do you deal with those things? Well, first of all, you add a mapping. So the destination field is field attachments, and the source column is files. And you add an option that all the files will be separated by a hashtag. So this means before you create a Drupal content, the files will be stored somewhere, and all the files will be separated by hashtags. The same thing for the images, will be separated by hashtags. So how do you get this done? Well, first of all, I created an array where I will store all the files I find. And next I do a regular rec match all. So I'm looking for all href or all A tags. in the text, and then I loop over all the matches, and I combine the base URL of the location where the folders are stored with the match I found. And then what I do is just basically the array with all the URIs of the files that are included in the answer. I just implode them with the hashtags, and the result of this function call, I store it back in the files property of draw. And that's the only thing you need to do to load files into Drupal. So the Migrate module takes care of downloading the files, storing in the right file system, and so on and so on. And for the images, it was basically the same story. The only difference is just mapping it to a different field, but the strategy I used was the same way. Do a reg match all, loop over all matches, fill an array, and finally implode them with a hash map. So once again, it looks easy and very logical, but it took me quite some time to figure this out. In both cases, make sure that your URI is readable, so set relevant permissions on the server to make it so. It also took me some time to realize this, because I was sure the URI was completely correct, but somehow didn't manage to load. So in this talk, I showed you a lot of things. So I had the 1 minute slide about the ETL process, the basic overview of the Migrate, and some various topics such as dependencies, DRUSH, the PREPAREROW function that's called before the Drupal entity is created, the prepare function, it's called before the created Drupal entity is saved, a multi-key map, some snippets from the user import, gate import, entity reference, and file and images. And to conclude this talk, I have a slide with some resources. So these are links. It should work. If not, I will add them to the session proposal on the website. So the Migrate documentation is really, really good, very extensive, very clear, and all the different aspects are very well explained. Also the advanced topics, such as stubs, I didn't have to use it, but it's already advanced, but it's very well explained. There is also a Migrate example module. It contains example migration of beer and wine. And the PT Mesh blog, there was one blog post I thought was very excellently written and was very clear on how to work with the Migrate module. So this concludes my talk. It's time for questions. Yeah.
Can Migrate module be used to push data from one Drupal site to another one on a regular basis, like daily basis, for example?
I should think so, because, and what do you mean by pushing data? So new data or updated?
So you import data every day from another site, data that you want to reuse. So between two different servers.
So to keep the content of both sides in sync then?
Yeah.
My first guess is yes, because you can use DRUSH as a command line to do the import, and my first idea is to have a cron to execute this command, and well, you have the option, I didn't mention, but you have the option to override already imported content. So normally if you have nodes number 1 and it's already imported in your other site, if you rerun the migration, it will see, I already imported node number 1, I will skip that. But you have an option to overrule this, so even if content already has been migrated, you can redo that. So that's my first idea. It's something you can do to synchronize two sites. If it's manageable, I don't know. If you're talking about a lot of content, it can take some time.
The fact that the database is on the server is not an issue.
No, it's just reads in this, whatever the source is, it doesn't matter if it's a file, a database, XML, JSON, it doesn't really bother.
You can also use it
feeds is also a possibility. Yeah.
How would you import objects with end-to-end relationship?
So,
How would you import objects from different databases with an end-to-end relationship? So you don't have the first object you can import because you need to mirror for the mirror reference the second object that doesn't still exist in the other way.
well, I haven't done it before, but I know that's a perfect example of the stubs I've been I briefly mentioned. So that's one of the advanced topics. So stubs is something you use if you have to reference content that has not yet been imported, and that's when you use these stubs. So I advise you to read up on stubs. It's in the advanced topics section on the Migrate documentation. Yeah.
Are there main differences for Drupal 8 for the Migrate module?
I haven't. Well, I took a look already to the migration of Drupal 8, but not into details, so I didn't try anything out. It seems to be that the main ideas are the same, so you have source, destination, and you have the mapping, and you have to map fields from one source to something to target. What I've seen that's different is that they use the plugin system of Drupal 8, and all those all related changes will be incorporated, but I think that the workflow will be the same. Some more questions? All right. Thank you for your attention.